Ready? Yeah. Welcome to the Design Podcast from the Methodist Church, conversations on living life to the full. Today I'm speaking with the Reverend Dr. Martyn Atkins, General Secretary of the Methodist Church in Britain. Martyn, welcome to
Thank you,
Methodist Church House, where you work.
Where I work, yes. It's 20 feet away from where I normally live.
We've taken you far. Martyn, discipleship has become something of a buzzword, not just in the Methodist Church, but actually we hear Christians of all kinds talking about it at the moment. For you, can you sum up in one sentence what discipleship means to you?
It means trying to be a follower of Jesus Christ in a way that makes sense in the time and place where you're living.
You've thought about that before. I didn't tell you the question before I asked you, did I? So I'm quite impressed. And you've described Methodism as a discipleship movement shaped for mission. So we're talking about what it means to follow Jesus in today's context, in this time. What does that mean when we're looking at being a movement shaped for mission?
Well, I think I've got to go a step further back than that. I've coined that phrase, but I've coined that phrase out of a wide range of conversations, which seems to echo or resonate with a kind of deep self-understanding, or at least a very deep aspiration among many Methodists, they're the kind of words, and they're somewhat religious words, but they articulate this kind of deep desire in Methodist people. And I think it's born out of what I call a disquiet, or a divine disquiet. The difference between a disquiet and a divine disquiet is we can be disquieted about all kinds of things. But if we believe that ultimately God is creating the disquiet, then spiritually you've got to say, well, what have I got to learn? What is it I'm listening for? I always go back to Paul Tillich, who said, people cry out to God when the ground under their feet is shaking, only to discover it's God who is shaking it. So you go back to asking the question. And I think that what I've urged Methodist people to do, and what many of us have felt we wanted to do, was to say to God, here we are, we're 270 years old, we've got this plant, we've got this money in the bank, we've got this number of people, here is the state of the world, here are the communities we work in, here are our friends and our relatives. Who are we and what do you want us to do? And I think it's that big question that really forms the background of saying, in religious speak, we desire to be a really good movement of people who try and embody individually and corporately what it is to be a useful vehicle for God, promoting the Christian faith and promoting and advertising and witnessing to what it is to be people whose lives are shaped by the grace of God in Christ.
And you spoke about the question, who are we and what do you want us to do? I mean, we've said discipleship is what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a follower of Christ. How does Methodist identity change the flavour, the look, the feel of discipleship? What's the Methodist identity that we stamp on discipleship? It can't be the same as, what it means to be a United Reformed Church person to follow Christ.
Well, there's a huge overlap. I mean, it's a little bit like all good ecumenism. You spend the first fertile time discovering that in spite of feeling that you're very distant or have no real knowledge of your Anglican neighbours or your Roman Catholic brothers and sisters somewhere else, the first thing that all conciliar and historic ecumenism discovers is that they've got 98% of things in common. It's the 2% that you then spend years and years and years trying to extrapolate or work together about. And it's the same about discipleship. I've not written or said anywhere, nor do I hear Methodist people say in a rather kind of exclusive kind of way, we're the best disciples of Jesus. Discipleship of Jesus is a common calling for anybody who would call themselves Christian. And I'm privileged to go around the world. I see people striving to be good followers of Jesus and living lives that are worthy of somebody who claims to be a follower of Jesus. In Pakistan, in Fiji, we're thinking at the moment of what it means to be a follower of Jesus when the government is telling you what you can and cannot do. In America, in a place of affluence or a different thing. In Britain, what does it mean to be a disciple? Well, 80-90% of it is just what it means to be everybody else. Are you a person of prayer? Are you a person who believes that God has a plan for the world? Are you a person who believes that God in Christ, when God entered the world, said, this is the kind of values, this is the kind of people I want you to be, that enrich and nourish and transform the world for good? Now, all those things, I think, are endemic in all discipleship. If you're asking me the question, what are the subtle, and I call them tones or moods of Methodist discipleship?
Makes it sound like a shelf at B&Q.
Well, it is in the sense that it's all paint, and it's all valuable paint, but you're likely as not to see in any Christian tradition something that marks it out, so that if you're an intelligent observer, they wouldn't have to tell you that they're Anglican or Baptist. You just pick it up in the sort of runes. Now, in Methodist speak, I could speak for a long while. It's a short video, but let me just focus on two things that I think are very important about Methodist moods and tones of discipleship. The first is the notion of connectionalism, which we wrestle with in all sorts of ways. But connectionalism, technical phrase, goes back to Methodist early days, but it effectively means that Methodist disciples feel themselves to be networked and related spiritually and in terms of their call to one another. So that historically it would mean that Methodists in one place are supported by Methodists in another place to do what individually they couldn't do apart. And therefore we have a network of churches throughout the country. We have ministers who are, in most cases, able to be lifted from one place and moved to another in response to the needs of the church and the call of society and the world. Now, that flexibility at its best, that interdependency at its best, is a very solid, concrete and real missional part of a Methodist way of doing discipleship. And the other is, and you find this in kind of the little booklet on discipleship that I wrote at the invitation of Methodists in the Connection, and also the General Secretary's report to the last conference. Also, I think that there are some moods and tones about what kind of life, interior and externally, best articulates a Methodist or a Wesleyan influenced disciple. And I think that the second thing, therefore, would be this absolute interdependence between what John Wesley called acts of mercy and acts of piety. That is, that you cannot extricate the fact that a Christian disciple prays, believes in God, desires to worship God, and that prayer and that worship of God automatically, instinctively acts itself out with an outward focus, an engagement with the world, what I call dirty fingernail spirituality, so that you cannot be a Methodist disciple and be distant from actually what's happening in the context behind you. Now, again, I'm not saying that all of the Christians don't have that, but it's so intrinsic to the Methodist idea of what it means to be a follower of Jesus that you can actually say in times of history that when other churches have been tempted to say, well, there's evangelism and there's piety and there's prayer over here, but we don't get involved in that, that's dirty, it's with the world, it's tainted. Or you get another group of Christians saying, if it's not about this and transforming the world and being engaged in society, what is it? Who needs to pray? This is prayer. The Methodist has felt uncomfortable with both of those positions because it pulls apart what they believe deep in their spiritual DNA belongs together. So those two things, I think, would be moods of Methodist discipleship. And
in my conversations with Methodists, I've often spoken to people who've said, you know, we're not really a church, we're a movement. We're not an institution, we're a movement. And you've used the term movement. And is that about this divine disquiet that you talked about, this kind of not being satisfied with where we are now and wanting to be somewhere else and wanting to be better and to do more? Is that what being a movement is about when we talk about Methodism as a movement?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, there's two ways of looking at the movement language. One is the idea that the Methodist movement was indeed a movement in the first instance, and you can go back to the origins of Methodism, and there's long and learned books. I mean, I partly did this in my PhD many years ago, that this idea that John Wesley sort of created Methodism almost by accident. It needed networking together. It had the possibility of exploding apart in different parts of the country for huge lengths of time. And John Wesley's genius, so many scholars say, was not the fact that he was a great preacher or anything else. It was the basis. It was that he travelled around and managed to network a pretty disparate group of spiritual vitality happening in Britain, in various parts of the country in the 18th century. So it was most certainly a movement in the first instance, rather than a new church, in the sense that, say, for instance, Baptists in the 16th and 17th century deliberately sought an ecclesiology around systematic theology, which they saw right from the beginning, even with the wrestlings of parting from the Roman Catholic Church as something that claimed to be the one holy church. Nevertheless, right from the beginning, it saw itself as an alternative church. I think the history of Methodism isn't quite as clear in terms of a secession from one thing to another to be an alternative church. What happens is that here is a renewal movement within Anglicanism, which very quickly gets overtaken by people becoming Christians who have no location in any kind of recognised Christian grouping. And so, not surprisingly, by the time you get near the later part of John Wesley's life, he's facing an uphill battle between people who say, this is all I know. I'm 50 years old and I've only ever belonged to a Methodist society. Of course it's church. So there's the backward historical theological bit, if you like, of this movement language. I don't think I'm not so much wedded to that, because I think that what we're saying by the phrase a discipleship movement shaped for mission is far more important to see it in forward think rather than simply backward think. I think what I'm doing when I mention the backward look is that it's not unconscionable to think of Methodism in origin as a movement.
It's not a break from tradition.
We're actually
it's not continuing.
That's right. It's not as if we're sort of inventing it from nowhere and saying it's no part of our tradition. Of course it is. The fact is that we're a church. We have sacraments as a church in the tradition. We take great delight in saying in our foundation deeds that we are a church in the Protestant Reformation, standing in the evangelical tradition. That's the language of the Deed of Union. So of course we're a church. I think what I've heard Methodists say to me, and I share with it fully, is that the language of a church has now become associated in many people's minds, wrongly, perhaps superficially, in clear terms, but nevertheless in instinctive terms. When they say we're a church, it means that we've got everything set. We've built the building, we've paid for the building, the pews are in, it's located here. And so from that settled position, every question then begins, this is set, how does this fit into this? Whereas I think the language of a missional movement or a discipleship movement shaped for mission means that you ask the missional call questions first, and then you say, how does what we've got change shape so that we're better able to do that?
So what are we going to do before we say, what do we look like at the moment?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. Like what?
So are you saying that we kind of go, okay, we look to the goal first and then figure out how we get there from here, rather than saying, well, how do we get those people over there to come through our church doors and sit down on a Sunday and be quiet for an hour and a half and listen to what we've got for them?
Well, that's a good example, because it's quite clear that missiologically, big word, in terms of what we see happening in our Western societies, and Britain is a particularly stark version of it. Grace Davy called Europe the exceptional case. Britain is a peculiar case within Europe, and quite a lot of sociologists of religion have recognised that. In Britain, what we definitely know is that the kind of worship and the kind of life that what we might describe as a lovely and devoted group of Methodists, that kind of life seems to commend itself to fewer and fewer people in the general population. And I think it's that sets up the disquiet and the disease in the most lovely of normal Methodists. And I think of huge numbers of people that I know in their 80s, 90s and downwards to whatever, who sort of say, well, it suits us and we've almost become churched in the sense that we understand what we're doing. But it grieves us to think that our children and our grandchildren seem to find no calories in this. It doesn't seem to be a life full enough. It doesn't seem to be a discipleship rich enough for them to say, there's anything in it for me, mum and dad, grandma and granddad. Now that sets up the disquiet. And I think that disquiet is there from God, if you like, that God is saying to us, well, you might be content, but is that sufficient? you know. And I think more and more Methodists are saying, no, the missional agenda is the one where we ask the question, what does God want of us in this time, with all our resources, with all our buildings, in order that the pearl of great price that some people who seem impervious to the Christian gospel, if we really believe it's good news, if we really believe that following Jesus is worth the candle at all, then what is this vehicle that we've got that God wants us to use more effectively to reach more people? Sure. Now, for me as the General Secretary, what that means is that I think we are saying to one another quite a costly thing, and that is that the things that might show the way, riskily, there's no guarantee, in reaching new constituencies with the gospel of Jesus Christ is primarily not geared towards bringing them back so they take their place in our pews and repopulate our churches in exactly the same way they've been for another generation, but that we put a disproportionate amount of time, effort, staffing and resourcing into teasing out ways whereby those other people can encounter an authentic Christian life in the 21st century. I think that's what God's calling us to do. And you can't do that while remaining everything saying, well, that remains untouched. We've got this little bit of fag-end time and fag-end money over here to spend exploring this. It's got to be a more radical shift. And so I think the General Secretary's report was saying, if you agree with this direction of travel, what we're saying is that everything's in the mix, but the general view of our church is that it's now a resource given to God, and nothing is sacred in the sense of there it is, in order that we move faster and more speedily and more wholeheartedly towards this kind of obedience.
So as General Secretary, it is your job to look at the big picture, to look at all of our resources.
I don't do it alone.
Yes, of course. To look at all our resources, to look at all our churches, our worship modes, our youth and children's work, everything, and to kind of take that in and digest that and have a cup of tea maybe, and then think about how do we move this forward? How do we take the risks that we think God is leading us to? How do we become that discipleship movement shaped for mission? In your opinion, what are the most pressing issues to take that forward?
I think the pressing issues were the ones that were identified in the General Secretary's report, but the General Secretary's report was in large part simply mirroring back to the connection what I'd heard over a number of years. So in a sense, I was stating back to the church, have we heard each other correctly? And it seems to be that the conference of 2011 said pretty overwhelmingly, yes, these are the kind of things we want to explore. Now, it seems to me that there are three things, generically, put very, very briefly. One is that we need to look again at the kind of ministries that resource our church and enable a rich witness and offering of service to our communities. So I articulated things like, what does a circuit leadership group look like, especially now that we've, in the last 3 years, lessened the number of circuits by about 150 to 170. You see, we forget that in 2006 there were 617 circuits with 1,790 active full-time presbyters. Now we're in a situation where we don't know exactly how many circuits there are, because every week something's changing, but we reckon something around about 490 at the moment, and falling. Now, it's not because there's a kind of like Orwellian, small circuits good, a small number of circuits is good, large number of circuits is bad. It's because we're recognising that very, very small circuits were reproducing large numbers of roles, taking up large amounts of time and energy from a limited number of people and vitality, so that we began to say to one another, we can do certain things in bigger units that release energy to focus more on things that really, really we feel need doing. And that's the impetus for me behind regrouping for mission. It's not simply that a strategy for decline. In fact, it's quite the opposite for me. I've got no interest in managing decline. Decline will manage itself. If you leave it alone, it'll sort itself out wonderfully. What I'm interested in is, what do we learn that by galvanising circuits or churches together, by reigniting vision, by reflecting on what discipleship is, by reflecting on what the interplay between lay and ordained people are as common disciples of Jesus, bearing witness in their life and in their work and what they're doing, how does all that refocus upon the core purposes. And then what happens out of that? So to resource those kind of ministries in small groups, in leadership teams, this idea of pastoral focus, partly to provide focus in a church, which very often sees itself as rather disconnected from one to the other, and also to release then the possibility that a group of people in ministry can themselves identify where that limited amount of ministry is best focused. You see, we can't do everything. So for the last 10 years we've said to ourselves, if we can't do everything, what is it we've got to do? And that's becoming an ever more pressing problem for us. And my answer is, we do the things that see ourselves as poured out in order to be a discipleship movement shaped for mission, which is given over to God for the good of others.
You talk about not being able to do everything. There is a kind of tendency among Christians to go, well, that's a good idea, and that's a good idea, and that's a good idea. So we must do all of the things that are good.
Yes.
And then you find yourself, I think, getting stretched thinner and thinner and thinner. But we do invest in new things, and we do invest in new ideas, like the Venture FX Pioneer Ministries scheme and the Youth Participation Project and Fresh Expressions. You know, we're a major partner in that. How do we keep doing those things that are good and are worth doing in the myriad stuff that we could be doing? How do we keep holding all that together? Is there a danger that by doing youth participation and Venture FX and then maybe traditional church in one area, that the church becomes so disparate it starts to pull apart?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there is that danger. Of course there is. And the more it seems to become an exotic thing that those who like doing that over there and has pristine money that doesn't touch. You see, I think the thing that really is coming home to us is that up to now we've been able to resource these exploratory, more outward-focused kinds of ministries. We've been able to resource them out of money that we've got in the bank. And so in a sense it's not touched what you might call the normal routine life of church as we've known it. That's going to change. In fact, it's changing already. Now, in a sense, we're put more and more in a situation of we can't do both. Which are we going to do? And I'm a person who is urging Methodism that the faithful, hope-filled thing to do is to increasingly take the risk of saying we use a greater proportion of the money that we have locally, how we spend it locally, on those things that are not simply servicing church as we know it. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not arguing it's somehow a debased way of using our resources. But all the signals are that if we continue to do that, we are missing a kind of vital call of God to be more engaged with things that work. And my answer would be to people who say, well, why do we have to do that? My answer would be because we're doing the 21st century version of what Methodism did at the first, and that is looking round and saying, how do those who don't find it easy to encounter the gospel, to see the relevance of Christ, to experience the love of God in society, what's going to be the instrument that God uses in order to do that? Rather than to sort of say, here we are, you know, come and join us if you feel somewhat comfortable or in need. So I've said very stupidly, boldly, whatever the phrase is, back to the church, we have 5,300 chapels. That's far too many for what we need. And that's not to say that they're all bad. You see, this is the nuance of the thing. I'm not saying, therefore, close them. What I'm saying is that we should be bold enough to say in every circuit, in every district, as a connection, is this fit for our purpose? Do we need them all? Do we need to own them all? What's the nature of a church as a satellite station of disciples in the world, as both a focus and a point for dispersal for ministry in the world? How many of them do we need and where should they be? And in a sense, what I'm hoping is that that's an energising question. It's not a dictatorial question. It's just simply a statement of fact. Because even without asking that question, we're losing 100, 150 a year through closure anyway. And at the moment, all that's happening is that the money from that is going in various places. But if it's simply retrenched back into a kind of central pot that enables the rest of them to survive without asking those kind of missional questions, then that really is a managing of decline. And I suspect that huge numbers of Methodists simply say we don't want to be as unimaginative and unmissional as that. So let's ask the questions. If we release that, can we do this? So I'm urging Methodism to continue to use for at least a long time yet, a disproportionate amount of finite resources in exploring what God might be leading us into. And if I can just say one more thing, I know time's going, the amount of money that we put in something like the Fresh Expressions Initiative is round about £110,000 a year. The stipend budget, I realise it's not like the stipend budget that we pay to sustain our ministers, quite right, is about £64 million a year. Now, that's the proportion of what we're talking about. It's very easy to say this is extra, it's somehow exotic. But look at it. In 7 years of the Fresh Expressions movement, our latest statistics for mission now tell us that 1/3 of all Methodist causes in the country have formed what they consider to be a fresh expression. And that's on £110,000 a year. It's good money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you say, we really nearly are out of time. But I want to ask you very quickly before we finish, very briefly, what kind of Jesus do you imagine when you think about the Jesus who is leading us forward through this divine disquiet?
I see I see an angry Jesus. I'm not governed by an angry Jesus. I mean, I'm a Methodist, I'm a Wesleyan, I'm sort of sloppy with prevenient grace. Jesus is all compassionate and all loving and all forgiving, and I never reach the end of his forgiveness. So, yes, that's the... But in terms of what the Spirit of Jesus is saying to the church, the Spirit of Jesus is saying to the church, can I use you or can't I? Are you going to be with me incarnationally in Britain in the 21st century, or are you going to be a movement that history consigns to a particular time in history, and history is replete with the bones of churches that didn't hear the cry to follow and accompany Christ into a new world, with dirty fingernails, with resolute prayer, with a pretty radical agenda of social change and social justice, and the promise of an inhabiting spirit that makes all things possible. That's the kind of Jesus.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Martyn. And if you've been listening and you want to track down some more of the Design podcasts, you can visit www.methodist.org.uk/design. That's DSIGN. And if you want to reflect on the issues further for yourself or with others, you might like to make use of the Design postcards, and you can find out more about them at that web address. So thank you very much for your time, Martyn.
Thank you.